So Ultra Red's been around for now, goodness, like 32 years. As was mentioned, we sort of started out like a lot of art projects where you don't really know what you're doing, but you do it to figure it out, right? I mean, I'm sure that would relate to most of the people that you or people you know who make work. People who write, sometimes we write not really knowing where we're going with the writing, but we need to write in order to find our way. So it was just a couple of us. A picture of the three of us looking all fresh and young. Yes, that's me without a beard. So we were very much interested in the club scene at that time, primarily doing chill out spaces, which was a kind of a space within raves or in clubs. I'm sure they still exist, where you just kind of relax or you come down off of whatever you're on. And so we would just be playing music in those spaces. We weren't playing dance music, it was more chill out spaces. We were also interested in incorporating some of the audio recordings that we were making in our political work, which at that time in 1994 was focused on the needle exchange in Hollywood, which is where I live. I'll go in more into that in a minute. So we were sort of figuring out how we had all these recordings from street-based needle exchange. And then we were in these like clubs that were just a few blocks away from the very places where we were doing needle exchange. And so how do these two worlds speak to each other when they oftentimes might rely on the same networks of, for drug access, but not social networks? The group sort of evolved over time, eventually became the four of us that are in this very sexy picture. Does anyone know where this is from? Anyone recognize this? I'm not surprised you don't because it doesn't exist anymore. But this is Pico Aliso, the public housing down in Boyle Heights. Those two structures that are flanking us, those two structures don't exist anymore. They were demolished in the late 90s, early 2000s. The four of us were sort of operating as kind of, a performance group. Because we had released a few albums, we were getting invitations to do the circuit of festivals and so forth, primarily in Europe. So those are the two albums that we released. And then, so being all like, concert-y type people, trying to like not anyone notice that we were just looking at laptops and everything was kind of pre-recorded, except for the microphones, which were hot and live. And then we were giving sort of, basically doing teaching. At that time, the top picture for Sonar, we were giving a presentation about immigration rights here in Los Angeles, again, long before the current situation that we're in right now. Eventually the group, and by 2012, had sort of expanded. We were then a much larger group of people from different parts of the world that had sort of found each other and accumulated people as we go through these tours. We would spend time in a city performing, and we would always ask, well, what's the political movement that's the best, the most alive and vibrant in this city? And sometimes that would lead us to comrades who we would fall in love with, they would fall in love with us. And then we would just say, hey, you know what, you should work with us. And that's how we sort of expanded. It was never any kind of like an official invitation process. It was just meeting people along the way. And so a number of these people in this picture with the group photo, we encountered in Germany who are part of a movement called Attack, which at that time in the late 90s, early 00s, was doing immigrant defense, immigrant rights in Germany, particularly at that time, there was a lot of discussion about legalization for immigrants. And so we would have debates, conversations about what does organizing look like in Germany versus here in the States. And then those folks would eventually begin to self-identify as members of our collective. That allowed us to bring in new people, new perspectives, new theoretical frameworks, but also then new tactics around activism and organizing. Eventually, in time, we stopped pursuing the concerts and stopped pursuing that kind of life. It's fun, it's exciting, but at some point it's a little too exhausting, and it kind of keeps you away from the work that you're doing politically, because there's this expectation that you're always going to be touring, because that's how you support yourself is through touring. And like a lot of times for visual artists, there's this expectation that you're doing a lot of residencies and that you're moving around constantly, which always works against any kind of place-based practice, which as an organizer is place-based. That helped us sort of respond to invitations to introduce a new idea of performance, which weren't just like, concerts, but were more of these kind of facilitated discussions of a listening session, much like we just did. So we would arrive into a city or hosted by a gallery or a museum, and we would find out what's the current mobilization or activism in that city, and we would bring folks together and we would do a listening session. This picture here is with the woman who's sitting next to me. She was involved in an aid service organization in Banff, Canada. She's basically the only staff person at that time. And so we were talking about like the status of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and where it was at in Banff, Canada. Banff is host to a very large arts organization that you know about, and had a long history of engagement with the AIDS crisis, but it was no longer being talked about by 2005, had kind of like fallen off the conversation, even though in town there was an AIDS service organization. So we wanted to sort of talk about where was the discussion, where was the conversation, why were those silences existent at that time in Banff. This was a thing that we were doing in a number of cities, in Pittsburgh and Montreal, and so forth. But this was another listening session that we did primarily with a group of folks who were organizing around immigrant defense, having to do with sort of pushing back against, Nazi anti-immigrant stuff, particularly in the rural part of the country. Listening session, listening to recordings, and then having a conversation. So again, these listening sessions were a way for us to continue conversations that we were having with people and to sort of test out a method, but it was still within a kind of a method or form that still was disconnected from the actual communities where we were doing the organizing. So if you could think about like the art context or the performance context was kind of a model, but not the thing itself. The thing itself was back home. And so this allowed us to test different ideas for how a listening session could generate conversation, but it wasn't necessarily going to feed back to those communities that we were working with. And that sort of dilemma of the artist that does their work somewhere else and then somehow is supposed to loop back to the work at home was a constant struggle for us. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how we try to resolve some of that. More listening sessions, very sexy listening sessions. So my own background, as a young person coming into an understanding that I am not right with the world, which is what I would call activism, was the AIDS crisis in the late 1980s. For those of you who know that moment, it was kind of a rather intense situation where you've had a lot of people who were being impacted by the AIDS crisis, much like COVID. But whereas COVID was a situation where everyone talked about COVID, you'd have to be living under a rock to not talk about COVID. With HIV and AIDS, unless you were directly impacted by HIV and AIDS, it was not a part of conversations. And that allowed for governments to sort of ignore the discussion until you needed a movement that would make it unavoidable. So this was kind of the situation that sort of I entered into with my beginning of a kind of activism at the age of 27. So this collective that I'm a part of, Ultra Red, by the time we get to the end of that first decade, so the 2000s, we had grown as that picture, we're about, now we were 12 people, we were in different cities, each of us involved in different social movement contexts. And this question came up, do we want to keep growing? Like, is this like we're in the process of world, domination or something? So we really didn't want to do that. But we did want to have an understanding of how do we bring all these things that we've been developing in the art context, how do we actually test them in the context where we are, where we're, trying to build power. And so the idea was to, instead of growing, was instead to try to start like a kind of we'll just say call it a school, to have a kind of school project. And the school project wasn't necessarily to teach people, it was really for them to teach us, for us to learn together. Part of it was also the fact that everyone wants peers. We all want peers. We all want to learn with people. But we were frustrated with the fact that most of our options were either artists who were primarily interested in their own individual practice, or they were nonprofit types who were completely contradictory, bound up in the nonsense of the nonprofit stuff. So what's the middle ground? And so how can we develop relationships, conversations with people, and learn with people that aren't bound by those two, limited by those two contexts? And so these school projects started. The first one out of the gate was in London. It was a class, actually, at Goldsmiths. It lasted as long as the school term. Once the school term was over, so did the project end. In Berlin, this grew out of a movement that was fighting for the recommunalization of public housing. And they were looking at engaging with the young people that were living in public housing. There was a little pop of money from a cultural foundation that allowed this project to proceed for about a year. The funding ran out, project ended. In New York, our folks in New York were very much involved in the house and ballroom scene, genderqueer, sort of Black and Latinos movement. And so they were interested in developing a kind of political education space for conversation learning within the house and ballroom scene. Lots to say here about all the contradictions around that, particularly in the New York house and ballroom scene is constantly being expropriated, constantly being brought in by the museums because it legitimizes the museums. Suddenly you have a lot of Black people, and then you move on with your programming. You don't have to have Black people anymore. So it was like this constant battle about when does the community get to do what it wants to do. In Los Angeles, we spent about 2 years trying to raise money to start a project. In the end, didn't get anywhere. So we decided just to do it ourselves. So it began in October of 2012. This picture, you can recognize the back of Ken's head. It was a space of over, where was this? This was like over like Highland Park, not Highland Park, it was like Atwater or something, I can't remember. A lot of CalArts people were there, and we're just kind of introducing what we wanted to do. We wanted to have a kind of a space to test popular education, which I'll say more about in a minute, to test out these ideas. And so this group eventually took shape, and it started a meeting. And so we met for about 10 years. And initially the focus of the group was, these are just goofy little flyers for our sessions. Initially, we really had an open call. We just wanted to ask, what are you hearing about are the issues in your community? So everyone who was a part of School of Echoes, which was the name of it, everyone was a part of that. We're just going around talking to neighbors, talking to small businesses, talking to nonprofits. What are you hearing are the concerns in this neighborhood? Fortunately, since most of the people who came into our group lived in different parts of the city, we were getting different inputs from the Crenshaw area, from Echo Park, from Boyle Heights, from Hollywood. And that allowed us to kind of get a sense of what was different across those neighborhoods, but then also what was shared, what was the same. And what was being said over and over and over again, it didn't matter whether it was Crenshaw or Boyle Heights. We're concerned about gentrification. So we decided, okay, let's focus on that. Let's focus on gentrification. So what is gentrification? So that allowed us to spend about 2 years doing a lot of reading, research, interviewing people about what this thing is, gentrification. And what was consistently the experience of gentrification, not necessarily the academic definition, but was the experience of gentrification, was that people who were poor were being replaced, displaced for someone else to make money. All kinds of definitions about gentrification. You could do a Google search and you'll get all kinds of things. But that was seen to us the most descriptive definition of what people were actually experiencing in this threat of being displaced. And then it also suggests, well, then who's coming in for the replacement? And oftentimes, what's the role of that person and the artist? What's the role of that person and the nonprofit and so forth, the small businesses and so forth? The question also obviously would come up, though, how do you fight it? Do you fight it? What does fighting gentrification look like? And who is the one most likely to fight? We started to think about the role of the tenant with regarding to gentrification, not just the tenant. We were looking at the whole, like, what's the role of the cops, what's the role of arts organizations, and so forth. But we also looked at tenants. And the idea that the initial thesis was, well, it seems like if tenants don't know their rights, they will just move when they're being told they have to move. But if they know their rights, then they won't move. We were very naive. We just thought we thought that would be the answer. So we held a number of tenants' rights workshops, thinking, okay, that's what we'll do. Just give people access to know your rights. We held two because it became clear very quickly is that it's not enough to know what your rights are. You oftentimes, when you're in a crisis situation, you need support. You need other people to stand with you. You're feeling a lot of pressure from the landlord who seems to hold all the power, and to just be the one who says, no, I'm not going to move. You need someone else who's going to stand alongside of you. In other words, you need a movement. So just real simple about what is popular education. So you have social action, you have like the space of where we live and where we experience life. But then you have kind of personal or communal experience of this context. And then you have a group that comes together to reflect on those experiences. Out of those reflections, there's a kind of synthesis or analysis that leads to an action that's then acted upon the social, which now is giving you new experiences, and then the cycle starts over again. So anyone who's doing any kind of organizing, this is oftentimes it's just done naturally. You don't really think about, oh, I am doing theory now. No, you're just naturally doing a kind of process of reflecting as a group on your experiences, synthesizing those reflections into an analysis, and then that shapes your actions. That is, I think, the most simple understanding of what we mean by praxis. This is what praxis is. Most of us think about praxis, oh no, that's theory, is action. This is a completely different understanding of praxis. This is around, this is not about, you have theory and then you act. This is about you have act and then you have theory.